I'm sure you've seen the headlines. Racist cop beats black woman. Her husband walks in with a badge. Today, we dive into this intense story, where the line between law enforcement and personal responsibility gets blurred in a shocking encounter. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the main characters of today's story. Meet Sarah Jones, a 32-year-old woman from a quiet suburban town. Sarah is no stranger to challenges, raising 2 kids on her own while juggling a full-time job at a local diner. But one evening, her life would take a drastic turn. It was just another regular Tuesday for Sarah as she walked home from work, the streets quiet under the dim glow of the streetlights. Her only thought was to get back to her children and settle in for the night. However, fate had other plans. As Sarah turned onto her street, a police car rolled up beside her. The officer behind the wheel, Officer Davis, a white man in his mid-30s, slowed down. He eyed Sarah from the window, his expression unreadable. Sarah, used to the occasional glances in her neighborhood, thought little of it and kept walking. But then, Davis made a sudden move. He stepped out of the car and approached her with a sense of urgency that immediately caught her attention. His voice was cold when he addressed her. "Hey you, stop right there." Sarah froze, unsure of what was going on. She hadn't done anything wrong, but his tone left no room for argument. "What's the problem, officer?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Davis didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked her up and down, his eyes lingering in a way that made her uncomfortable. He then raised his voice. "I said stop." Now, confused but not wanting to escalate the situation, Sarah stood still. Something about the officer's demeanor felt off, but she couldn't put her finger on it. She took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. But the tension in the air was palpable. The officer was close now, his presence imposing. Sarah was a strong woman, but in that moment, she felt small. Just as she began to question her next move, the officer barked another order. "You're under suspicion. Turn around and face the car." The words hit Sarah like a slap. She felt a cold wave of fear wash over her. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she knew it didn't feel right. Her instinct screamed at her to do something, but she had no idea what. Before Sarah could react, the sound of a car approaching from behind interrupted the tension. A second police car, different from the first, pulled up. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as the door opened, and she saw who was getting out. It was Ethan Jones, her husband. Ethan, a fellow officer with the local police department, had been working a late shift and was driving home when he saw the scene unfold. He recognized his wife immediately, standing there, facing down a fellow officer. His stomach churned as he realized something wasn't right. Without hesitation, Ethan rushed over, his voice firm as he called out to Davis. "Davis, stop. What the hell is going on here?" His tone left no room for argument, and for the first time, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. As Ethan approached, his eyes locked onto the situation unfolding in front of him. His wife, Sarah, stood frozen, with Officer Davis blocking her path. Sarah's breath hitched as she saw Ethan rush toward them. She could see the tension in his face, a mixture of concern and anger, as he swiftly approached the scene. His uniform was still pressed and neat, but there was something in his eyes that made Sarah's heart race. Ethan didn't hesitate. "Davis, stop right there," he called out, his voice commanding and sharp. Officer Davis turned his head slowly, as if he hadn't expected to see Ethan. His face tightened, but he didn't back down. "Ethan, what's the matter?" Davis asked, his voice dripping with an unsettling calmness. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he stepped closer to the situation, now standing between his wife and his fellow officer. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, and in that instant, he knew the stakes were higher than just a simple misunderstanding. "What do you think you're doing, Davis?" Ethan's voice was firm, but Sarah could hear the strain beneath it. He wasn't just worried about his wife, but about the implications of this moment. Davis didn't respond immediately. Instead, He gave a brief glance at Sarah, then back to Ethan, before muttering under his breath, "She was acting suspicious." Ethan's eyes flashed with disbelief. "Suspicious? You stop a woman on her own, at night, in her own neighborhood, for nothing but a gut feeling." Ethan's words were a challenge, his voice rising. The tension in the air was palpable, and Sarah felt a knot form in her stomach. She knew Ethan, knew his sense of justice, and knew he would not let this slide. But at the same time, she could see the internal conflict written all over his face. Officer Davis shifted his weight, and for a brief moment, Sarah thought he might try to argue further. But instead, he took a step back, almost as if reconsidering his position. Ethan kept his gaze locked on Davis, not willing to let the moment slip away. "We both know this isn't right," Ethan said, his tone softening slightly, but still filled with resolve. "I want to know exactly why you're stopping my wife." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of authority and responsibility. Sarah's breath came out in a soft exhale. It was the first time she felt a sense of safety since the whole interaction had started. She could see the power dynamics at play, how Ethan, though a fellow officer, was not going to tolerate his colleague's behavior. Davis hesitated again, his hand twitching at his side, as if he were considering what to do next. For a split second, Sarah wondered if Davis might make another move. But to her relief, Ethan's steady presence seemed to anchor the situation. "You can't do this, Davis." "Not here. Not now," Ethan added, his voice a mix of frustration and authority. The standoff between the two men felt like it was stretched tight, like a rubber band about to snap. Finally, Davis looked down at the ground, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He didn't say another word. Ethan turned to Sarah, his gaze softening as he reached out to her. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Sarah nodded, still in shock, but grateful. She could see the weight of what had just happened sink into Ethan's expression. It wasn't just about protecting her. It was about what this moment represented, about the larger issue of how people in authority wield their power. Ethan turned back to Davis, his tone now final. "I'm going to report this. You can't treat people like this, especially not in our own neighborhood." With that, Ethan led Sarah away from the scene, the quiet hum of the night air the only sound as they walked toward their home. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but in that moment, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone in this fight. Ivan had never seen his wife look so shaken before. As they walked back to their small home, Sarah remained unusually quiet, her eyes focused on the ground as they made their way through the familiar streets of their neighborhood. The sounds of distant traffic, the chirping of crickets, and the soft rustle of leaves in the night breeze filled the air, but Sarah's mind was elsewhere. Ethan could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The anger he had felt in the moment when he intervened was still there, but now, as they walked side by side, it was mixed with concern for his wife. He knew Sarah well enough to understand that she was no stranger to challenges, but this was different. This wasn't just an ordinary day. It was something that would linger in both of their minds for a long time. Ethan glanced over at her, his heart aching. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked gently, his voice soft and full of concern. Sarah nodded slowly, but he could tell that her mind was racing. He could see the quiet storm brewing behind her eyes. "I'm fine," she said, her voice distant, though she was trying to sound reassuring. But Ethan knew better. He knew when she was holding something back. "Sarah," he said, stopping in his tracks and gently placing his hand on her arm to get her attention. "You don't have to pretend with me. I know this wasn't easy." She stopped too, finally looking up at him, her eyes meeting his. There was a flicker of emotion in her gaze, fear, frustration, and something else that he couldn't quite place. "I just don't understand why it happened," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "I've lived here for years. I've never caused any trouble. Why would he do that? Why would he treat me like that?" Her words hung in the air, filled with a sense of disbelief and hurt. Ethan felt his heart break as he listened to her. The pain in her voice was a reminder of something that was all too real for so many people, something that was happening right under their noses every single day. The injustice, the unfair treatment, the discrimination. I don't know, Sarah, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I really don't know. But what I do know is that you didn't deserve that. No one deserves to be treated like that. They stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle between them. Ethan knew that his words couldn't undo what had just happened, but he hoped they could offer her some comfort, even if just for a second. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. I just feel helpless, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Like I can't do anything about it. Ethan squeezed her arm gently. We'll do something about it, he said firmly, his determination rising. I'm going to make sure that nothing like this happens again. We're going to report this, and I'm going to make sure Davis is held accountable. Sarah's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of hope crossing her face. She had never seen Ethan so determined, so resolute. She had always known that her husband was a man of integrity, but this was different. This was personal. Are you sure? She asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. What if nothing happens? What if they just brush it under the rug? Ethan paused for a moment, thinking carefully. He could see the fear in her eyes, the fear of being ignored, the fear of not being believed. He knew all too well how that felt, but he wasn't going to let that happen. I'm sure, he said, his voice steady and unwavering. And if they do, we keep pushing. We don't stop. We keep fighting until the right thing is done. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of doubt. But there was none. All she saw was a man who would do whatever it took to make things right. Slowly, she nodded, her resolve strengthening. Okay, she said softly. Okay, we'll do it. Ethan smiled, giving her a reassuring squeeze before they continued, walking toward home. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew that they were in this together. And together, they would make sure that what happened tonight wouldn't be forgotten. Ivan could feel the tension in the air as he sat across from Sarah at their kitchen table. The small, dimly lit room was quiet except for the faint ticking of the wall clock and the soft hum of the refrigerator in the corner. Sarah had her hands folded in front of her, her fingers tapping nervously on the surface. Ethan, having just returned from his meeting with his supervisor at the police station, was still processing everything that had happened. He had filed a complaint, but he knew the battle wasn't going to be easy. So what happens now? Sarah finally asked, breaking the silence. Ethan looked at her, the uncertainty in her voice mirroring the anxiety that was gnawing at him. He had done his part by reporting Davis, but he wasn't naive. The system wasn't always as quick to act as people hoped, and he feared it might take a long time for anything meaningful to happen. Now we wait, he replied, though he could hear the frustration in his own voice. We wait for the department to investigate, and then we'll see what they do. Sarah let out a deep sigh, clearly not satisfied with the answer. She leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms over her chest. What if they don't do anything? What if they sweep it under the rug? She asked, her voice laced with worry. Ethan hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to respond. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her that everything would be fine, but he couldn't make that promise. What he could promise, however, was that he wouldn't let this go. If they don't do anything, he said firmly, we take it further. We go public, we contact the press, we make sure people hear about this. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. You're serious? She asked, almost as if she hadn't expected him to go that far. Ethan nodded. I've seen how these things get buried, he said, his voice resolute. I won't let that happen. Not with you. Not with anyone. This is bigger than just us now. Sarah's expression softened slightly, though she still looked uncertain. But what if it makes things worse? What if Davis or someone else tries to come after us? She asked quietly, her concern obvious. Ethan reached across the table and took her hand in his, squeezing it gently. I won't let anyone hurt you, Sarah. I promise. He knew that wasn't a guarantee, but it was the truth. He wasn't just doing this for his career, for his reputation. He was doing it because Sarah deserved better, because no one should ever feel powerless in the face of injustice. We'll handle it together, he added, his voice softening. Sarah nodded slowly, but Ethan could still see the worry in her eyes. He understood it. The fear of the unknown, the possibility that the system might not have their back. He shared that fear too. But he also knew that there were moments when people had to stand up, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. As they sat in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by the warmth of the evening, both of them knew that this was only the beginning. Ethan's commitment to seeing this through had never been stronger, and though Sarah's uncertainty lingered, she knew that together they would face whatever came their way. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time in a while, Sarah felt a sense of control. She wasn't just the victim of an unfair situation anymore. She was a part of the solution, and that gave her the strength to keep moving forward. Ivan could feel the tension building up in the days that followed. Despite his promise to Sarah, things weren't moving as fast as he'd hoped. The police department had launched an internal investigation, but progress seemed slow. He knew that things didn't always change overnight, but the waiting was taking its toll on both of them. Every day, Sarah seemed to grow more anxious, her hopes slipping just a little more. Ethan could see the toll it was taking on her. The woman who had always been strong and independent now seemed to carry a heavy weight on her shoulders. It was as if the emotional burden of the whole situation was starting to crack through her usual resilience. One evening, after a long day of work, Ethan came home to find Sarah sitting in the living room, staring at her phone. The room was quiet except for the hum of the ceiling fan, and Sarah looked up only when she heard the door open. Her eyes were tired, but they lit up slightly when she saw him. "Hey," she said softly, her voice carrying a trace of weariness. Ethan smiled and walked over to her, dropping his bag by the door. "How was your day?" he asked, though he already had a pretty good idea. Sarah sighed, putting the phone down on the coffee table. "Same as usual," she said, her voice faint. "I saw Davis today. He was walking around the station like nothing happened, like it's business as usual." Ethan's heart sank. He had feared this moment, when the system would fail them, when things would go back to normal for everyone except those who had been wronged. "Did you say anything?" he asked, his voice tight. Sarah shook her head, running a hand through her hair. "What's the point? He wouldn't even care." Ethan sat beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's not about him," he said gently. "It's about making sure people know the truth, about holding him accountable." Sarah met his eyes, and for the first time in days, she looked at him like she truly believed he could make a difference. "I'm scared, Ethan," she admitted quietly. "What if this whole thing just blows up in our faces?" Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke, and Ethan could feel the raw emotion behind her words. "What if nothing changes? What if Davis gets away with it?" Ethan's chest tightened. He hated hearing her doubt, hated seeing her so vulnerable. But he understood. She was scared. Scared of being silenced. Scared of fighting a system that might not care. "I won't let him get away with it," Ethan said firmly, squeezing her shoulder. "We won't let him." Sarah looked down, her fingers tracing the edge of the coffee table, deep in thought. "I just want to feel like I'm not alone in this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let Sarah fight this battle alone. "You're not alone," he said softly, his voice filled with conviction. "We're in this together. We'll keep pushing, no matter how hard it gets." For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint sound of their breathing. Sarah's eyes softened, and she leaned into him slightly, finding comfort in his presence. "Okay," she said after a long pause, her voice steadier now. "Let's keep going. Together." Ethan kissed the top of her head, a small but meaningful gesture of reassurance. "Together," he repeated. As they sat there, the weight of the world still heavy on their shoulders, they both knew that the road ahead would not be easy. But they also knew that they had each other, and together, they would face whatever came their way. Ivan woke up early the next morning, the weight of the previous night still lingering. He had been up late, pacing through his thoughts, wondering how things would unfold. The internal investigation was ongoing, but so far there had been no new updates. He knew it was a slow process, but he couldn't help feeling restless. Sarah had barely slept, and he could sense the anxiety in her eyes, even as she tried to mask it. They had made progress, but the uncertainty of what would happen next was a heavy burden. As he walked into the kitchen, he found Sarah already sitting at the table, sipping her coffee. Her eyes were tired, and her usual energy seemed drained. But she smiled faintly when she saw him. "Morning," she said quietly, setting her cup down. Ethan returned the smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Morning. How did you sleep?" he asked, pulling out a chair and sitting beside her. Sarah shrugged slightly. "Not great," she admitted, her voice low. "I just can't shake this feeling, you know. What if we're doing all this for nothing?" Ethan reached over and took her hand in his. He knew the fear was real. He had it too. "We're not doing this for nothing," he said, his voice steady. "We're doing this because it's the right thing to do. And sometimes that's all we can control, the right thing." Sarah looked at him, her eyes searching his face for reassurance. "I just feel like I'm fighting a system that doesn't care. What if we lose? What if everything we're doing doesn't matter?" The doubt in her voice made his heart ache. He squeezed her hand. "It matters," he said firmly. "It always matters. We may not have control over everything, but we have control over our actions, over our integrity. That's what we're doing, fighting for what's right." Sarah took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. Ethan could see the internal struggle she was going through. She was strong, but this was testing her in ways she had never imagined. "I know it's not going to be easy," Ethan continued, "but we have to keep pushing. For you, for me, and for everyone who's ever felt this way." There was a long pause as Sarah processed his words. Finally, she nodded slowly, her shoulders relaxing just a bit. "Okay," she said quietly, almost to herself. "Okay, we keep going." Ethan smiled at her, proud of the strength she was finding again. "Together," he said, his voice full of conviction. They sat there for a moment, the quiet hum of the morning wrapping around them. They didn't know what the next step would be, but they knew they would face it together. Ethan wasn't sure how the investigation would turn out, but he knew one thing for sure. He would fight until the end. He wasn't going to let Sarah or anyone else face this alone. As they finished their coffee, they both knew that this battle was far from over. The journey would be long, and there would be obstacles along the way. But with each other, they would find the strength to keep moving forward. And for the first time in days, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone in this fight. They were in it together, and that made all the difference. Ivan and Sarah had been waiting for days, but the response from the department had been anything but reassuring. The investigation into Officer Davis's actions had stalled, and with every passing day, Sarah's anxiety seemed to grow. She had hoped for some kind of clarity, some sign that things were moving forward, but all she had received were vague promises and silence. Ethan could see the toll it was taking on her. Every day, it felt like she was losing a little more of herself, her spark dimming with each new setback. He tried to keep her spirits up, but the constant uncertainty was wearing them both down. One afternoon, as Ethan was getting ready to leave for another shift, Sarah pulled him aside. Her face was set, determined in a way he hadn't seen in weeks. "Ethan, I can't just sit around and wait anymore," she said, her voice steady but filled with a new resolve. Ethan stopped, sensing the shift in her tone. "What do you mean?" he asked. Sarah took a deep breath, her eyes meeting his. "I'm going to take this to the media. We can't keep waiting for them to do the right thing. If they won't listen to us, maybe the public will." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The media was a double-edged sword. It could shine a light on their cause, but it could also backfire in ways they weren't prepared for. "Are you sure about this?" he asked cautiously. "It's not going to be easy. You know how the press can be." Sarah nodded, her expression unwavering. "I'm sure. It's the only way to make sure this doesn't get buried. I'm not just doing this for me, Ethan. I'm doing this for anyone who's ever been treated like this, who's been silenced. We can't stay quiet anymore." Ethan looked at her, his mind racing. He knew she was right. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about something bigger. But the fear still lingered. "Okay," he said after a moment, his voice low. "If we do this, we do it together. I'll be with you every step of the way." Sarah smiled, a small but genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I knew you'd say that," she said softly. Together, they began to make their plans. The next day, they met with a reporter who had been following the case. He was cautious, but he listened intently as they shared their story, the fear and frustration that had been building up inside them spilling out. As they spoke, Sarah's voice remained steady, but there was an unmistakable strength behind her words. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a woman who had found her voice, who was ready to fight. Ethan could feel the weight of the decision, but he also felt something else: hope. The road ahead was uncertain, but they were no longer passive in their own story. They had taken control, and that made all the difference. When the story finally aired, it didn't take long for the community to respond. Messages of support flooded in from all over. People who had been following the case expressed their outrage, their empathy. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt like she wasn't alone. It wasn't the end of the fight, but it was a step forward. Ethan stood beside her, proud of her courage, proud of the woman she had become through this ordeal. They didn't know where this journey would lead, but they were no longer just waiting for answers. They were creating their own. The battle was far from over, but together, they were ready to face whatever came next. As the days passed, Ethan and Sarah felt a shift in the air. The media coverage had sparked a wave of public attention, but they knew it wasn't over yet. The department had yet to respond with any significant action, but the pressure from the community was undeniable. People from all walks of life reached out to offer their support, sharing their own stories of injustice and discrimination. It was overwhelming, and yet it gave Sarah a sense of strength she hadn't felt in weeks. She wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore. The overwhelming response also brought with it a new level of scrutiny. Local news outlets followed up with questions, and social media exploded with conversations about the case. Some people were supportive, others critical, but what mattered was that the conversation was happening. The silence that had once surrounded her struggle was finally being broken. Ethan watched as Sarah became more resolute with each passing day. She had always been a fighter, but now there was a fire in her eyes, a fire fueled by the countless people who had reached out to her. She had found her voice, and she was using it. One afternoon, Ethan came home to find Sarah on the phone, her face a picture of concentration. He quietly sat down across from her, waiting for her to finish. When she hung up, she turned to him, a mixture of exhaustion and excitement in her expression. "That was the lawyer," she said, her voice steady. "They're ready to take the case further." Ethan's heart raced. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the legal support to take on the system. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded. "We're not backing down, Ethan. We're taking this to court if we have to." Ethan felt a surge of pride in his chest. He had known Sarah was strong, but seeing her so determined, so sure of herself, was something else. "You're incredible," he said softly, his voice filled with admiration. "We're in this together, remember?" Sarah smiled at him, the weight of everything they had been through reflected in her eyes. "Together," she echoed. That night, they sat together, planning their next steps. It wasn't just about holding Officer Davis accountable anymore. It was about making sure that their fight would lead to something bigger, a change in how the system treated people of color, a shift toward accountability and justice. Sarah had become a symbol for many, a voice for those who felt powerless in the face of discrimination. She hadn't set out to be a symbol. She had simply wanted justice for herself, for the pain she had endured. But now, her struggle had become a beacon of hope for others who had suffered in silence. As they continued to strategize, Ethan and Sarah knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, there would be setbacks, and there would be moments of doubt. But they also knew that they were no longer just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for something much greater, something that could make a real difference. As they talked late into the night, Sarah leaned into Ethan, feeling his support more than ever. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew one thing. Together, they would face it head-on, and they wouldn't stop until justice was served. Ivan and Sarah sat in their living room, the tension in the air almost tangible. It had been weeks since they had decided to take their fight to court, and now they were sitting in a room filled with legal documents and notes. They had a team of lawyers working tirelessly on their behalf, but the road ahead was far from easy. They knew the challenges they faced, not just legally but emotionally. The strain was evident in Sarah's tired eyes, But there was something else there now: determination. She had transformed over the past few weeks, her quiet strength turning into something that couldn't be ignored. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for all those who had been overlooked, marginalized, and silenced. Ethan could see the weight of it all pressing down on her, but he also saw the fire in her eyes, the spark of hope that had been reignited. "Are you ready for this?" he asked softly, breaking the silence. Sarah looked up at him, her expression unwavering. "I'm as ready as I'll ever be," she replied. "We've come this far, and I'm not backing down now." Ethan nodded, his heart swelling with pride. He had always known Sarah was strong, but seeing her like this, so resolute, so unyielding, was something entirely different. "We'll do this together," he said, his voice firm. Sarah smiled, a small but powerful gesture. "Together," she echoed. As they prepared for the next phase of the legal battle, the media attention around their case continued to grow. The story had spread far beyond their local community, and soon, people from all over the country were reaching out to offer their support. Some sent messages of encouragement, while others shared their own stories of injustice and discrimination. Sarah had become a symbol of resistance, a voice for those who had long been silenced. But with that recognition came even more pressure. They were no longer just fighting for justice in their own case. They were fighting for something much bigger. The stakes had never been higher. The day of their first court appearance arrived, and the tension was palpable. Sarah stood beside Ethan, her hand tightly gripping his. The courtroom was filled with reporters, cameras flashing as they took their seats. Sarah could feel the weight of every eye on her, but she stood tall, her back straight, her heart beating in steady rhythm. This wasn't just about Officer Davis anymore. It was about all the people who had been treated unjustly, about the need for accountability in a system that too often overlooked the voices of the marginalized. As the proceedings began, Sarah felt a quiet resolve settle over her. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was finally on the path to something real, something that could bring about change. The battle was far from over, but she was no longer afraid. Together, with Ethan by her side, she would see this fight through to the end. No matter how long it took, no matter the challenges they faced, they were in it together. And with every step forward, Sarah knew that they were one step closer to achieving the justice they had been seeking all along.